Welcome, everyone. Good to be with you, and I'm excited to continue to step through 1 Corinthians with you. If you get a second and you haven't, could you rate the podcast, review the podcast, just wherever you're listening, if you're on Spotify or Apple, or if you're on YouTube, follow the Ministries Collective, follow the podcast, subscribe. All those things really help us out. It's a great blessing to us, and if you're listening to this episode and you think it might benefit somebody, would share it with somebody. We give these things freely as a benefit and a blessing to the church. We're with the Ministries Collective, as many of you know, and we're about equipping and putting resources in the hands of the people of God to perform the will of God for the glory of God. And so this is what this is. And so if you know one of your fellow Christians that you think can benefit from this and it'll be a blessing to them, just send it on over and let this help them out. Today we're looking at 1 Corinthians chapter 12, verses 4 through 7. 1 Corinthians 12, verses 4 through 7. Now, there are varieties of gifts, but the same Spirit. And there are varieties of ministries, but the same Lord. There are varieties of effects, but the same God who works all things in all persons. But to each one is given a manifestation of the Spirit for the common good. Today, we're continuing our study of spiritual gifts, which will really go through chapter 14. Paul has been dealing with various aspects of the Corinthian character that is out of line with the ethics of the kingdom of God. He uses chapters 1 through 4 to build, the identity of who they are, united with Christ. And then chapter 5 focuses on the man who is sleeping with his father's wife. Chapter 6 deals with lawsuits and the danger of sexual immorality. Chapter 7 deals with an extensive discussion of marriage, intimacy, and divorce. Chapter 8 through 10 deals with food offered to idols, with an excursus on the support of gospel ministers to give us insight about Christian liberty. Chapters 8 through 10, I'll just pause. This is in my notes, but it was one of my favorite sections. There's so much going on there. It's so cool. Chapter 11 deals with the issue of head coverings and headship before shifting to a discussion on abuse of the Lord's table and the exploitation that occurred because of it. Last week, we started on this discussion of spiritual gifts where Paul declared that he didn't want them to be ignorant about spiritual gifts and their nature. He specifically highlighted their time in paganism, and that was partly because of ignorance, and he talks about the destructiveness of that ignorance. An ignorance around the topic of gifts given by the Spirit of God could lead to a similar fallout because of the potential weaponization of the Word of God, that someone says, oh, I have a word from God. And the people who made claims about that in idolatry were wrong, and it led to serious fallout. And if people make claims about that and use that in the wrong way, with sort of as God's stamp of approval on them in their context, then it could cause similar fallout. And it was causing similar fallout. As such, they need to understand what comes from God and what doesn't, and his intention for it, and we need that same understanding. In their context, the testimony of Christ, whether confession or curse, would be that method of discernment along with other things, and likewise, we need to learn to discern as well what is truly from God. Today, we're going to learn about God's will in the Spirit's work, and likewise as it pertains to the difference between the ways people manifest those giftings. And our big idea is there is unity in our diversity. There's unity in our diversity. So number one, there are differences. Number two, there's Trinitarian alignment. And number three, manifestations are for the common good. There are differences, there is Trinitarian alignment, and manifestations are for the common good. Differences, alignment, and manifestations are going to guide our study today. As I go through this text, as I go through any text really and sit down and begin to try to understand what is this saying, how do I learn from this, and how do I teach it with you guys, I've got a list of observations that I make about the text, and they include verbs and repetition and various other ones. If you're interested in that, you can reach out to me about it. But one of the critical ones I make is contrasts and repetition. It's not hard to see that this is a repetition of contrasts. In some sense, each verse is saying many effects, but one source. And so our big idea is that there's unity in diversity. Kind of comes down to that final point, which is a restatement. There's some sense in which this is just kind of a classic 1, 2, 3 points that leads to a bigger point that I think is just really, really cool. And so rather than taking verse 1 and then verse 2 and then verse 3 and kind of looking at that, that's how we normally take it. But I want to just note so that there's kind of parallels all the way through, that you can look at the first half, verse 4, 5, and 6, and the second half, verse 4, 5, and 6, and they're kind of all saying the same thing, that they work in parallel here. I think on my hands, if depending on where you're looking at the camera, they may need to go the other way. If you're on the podcast, you have no idea what I'm talking about. So there you go. All right, so where are we in this? In each verse, there are varieties. There's varieties of gifts, of ministries, and varieties of effects. These are things that are present in various kinds of people. We might say the people of God have a variety of gifts. The people of God have a variety of ministries, and the people of God provide a variety of effects. In Paul's day, there were a variety of ways that the Spirit of God supernaturally empowered people to serve and to demonstrate the power of God. And so too today, people can have a vast array of physical talents and natural proclivities. There are people today who one of their talents is that they can just do anything. They just learn anything and pick it up, and they're just naturals. Ultimately, this demonstrates people's different abilities, and some people can pick up one thing and not another thing. And Paul will go on next week to talk about the different abilities that are generated by the Spirit. So what do we have here? We've got ministries. They refer to service. There are different ways that people serve. There's a variety of gifts and gifting, so there's different services or different way people serve. So obviously, there's different capacities and offices, but also in the informal ministries of the ways people serve and contribute. At our church, we've got members that serve at a boys' home, where there's young men, boys that don't have a home to go to, and it gives them a shelter and food and upbringing, and tries to reform their lives from difficult home situations. There are people that serve there, others that serve at a homeless shelter. Others do study with gospel prospects or do members. So these are all different ways that people serve. Similarly, there are different effects or there are different results. There's men who can preach in a way that moves the heart of a dozen, if not dozens of people and convicts them of sin. And there are sisters who can take a meal and strengthen the heart of someone who's struggling. There's just a different effect in those two actions. And as we'll kind of see, kind of coming into the next point, is that even though there's differences there, one is not better than the other. They're all needful, and they all come from the same source. And one of the things, I'm tipping my hand, but I think most of us have heard this passage before. One of the things Paul's going to get to is that we shouldn't despise one another in those things. That we shouldn't look at, there's more people here, and there's less people here, therefore this is a better effect. No, there's just differences in effects. So next, we notice that Paul speaks to the power behind these things. It's the same Spirit, the same Lord, and the same God that is supplied behind all these things that makes it happen. Again, as we saw in chapter 2 and chapter 6, as well as with the high Christology in chapter 8, that 1 Corinthians is really full of the work of Father, Son, and Spirit. That's why we call this Trinitarian alignment. In this case, I don't think we should say the Spirit's in the gifts lanes, the Son is in the ministry lanes, and the Father's in the effects lanes, and they're just, it's this statement of, quadrants that they're uniquely and solely in with no crossover. Rather, that is to say that the uniqueness of individuals in possessing and demonstrating these gifts, ministries, and effects, it doesn't come about because of different persons wrestling the controls. It's like, well, one person's really good at public speaking, another person's really good at hospital visits. And it's like, one reason you might say that is, well, there were two people that were in charge of distributing, and so this person gave this one, and then this person gave that one. And that's what he's saying. That's not what happened. What he's saying is there was one heart and one personality behind each of those things, and everybody gets according to intentionality. The Spirit in his person intended for there to be a diversity of gifts. The Son in his person intended for there to be a diversity of ministries. The Father in his person intended for there to be a diversity of effects. And so this doesn't come about because there was a fight for control and, it kind of just it's like, here's the gift box or the ministry box or the effect box. And it's like everybody's fighting over it. It kind of gets pulled and everybody kind of gets different things. No, there was an intentional deliverance of those things. And in their respective wisdom, they knew this and intended this. It's not an accident. It's intentional that we are different. Moreover, with the eternal heart of God, unified in love before time began, there's complete agreement between Father and Son and Spirit and unity of all on the most basic level. We can see the echoes of this text in the Upper Room Discourse where Jesus, out of love for the disciples and love for fulfilling the will of God that he had been sent to do, calls on the love of the Father for him to send the Spirit and see that Christ is proclaimed to the glory of the Father. And so in the very nature of God, we see similarities that they all uniquely and absolutely partake in the fullness of God and the fullness of deity, but there's also the distinguishing of persons. And what that does is it leads to the mutual cooperation and flourishing of the whole, which becomes a model for Christian unity. Finally, in verse number 7, we read a bit of what was said that very much aligns with our big idea. While there are differences that come from the unity of the one God, dwelling eternally as in the persons of Father, Son, and Spirit, To each one was given a different manifestation of the Spirit. I'll continue to drive that I do believe this speaks to individual miraculous impositions of the Spirit on the created order. And while that informs our understanding of our natural talents, that there is a slight difference in interpretive level. That said, to each person was given one of these manifestations, and notice why. Why? It's for the common good. And I obviously believe it doesn't take a whole lot of exegetical or hermeneutical, crossing the context into the modern world to see that understanding applies to how we think about our physical talents today. That just as people have different talents today, the Spirit of God would impart different abilities to people, which we'll outline explicitly and extensively in our next study, though there's other lists in Romans as well. Today, people might have the ability to speak or to serve. Some people are good with ideas. Some people are good at telling us ideas are bad, and we need to go back to the drawing board and start again. Other people are good at putting plans into place. Other people are good at being just a cog in the wheel. Some people are good at making sure that we don't leave the project half done, but it's like, hey, we said we're going to do this. We got to finish this thing. Some people are good at technical skills. Some people are good at communication, music, finance, just to name a few. In all those areas, I've taken advantage of people. Oh, I skipped a line there. I've also got counseling, mechanics, computers, lawn maintenance, engineering, medicine, small engine repair. So there you go. There's a lot more of these, and I think I have been the benefit and the recipient of people who are superior in their proficiency to me in all of those areas. And they're all different. But notice why they're given. And as we think about ourselves and our various things, they're given for the common good. God's intention in our unique equipping and the ways that we are all different is to serve the purpose of the common good, to serve everyone's needs being met. God didn't give us unique abilities and talents so we can be a special butterfly or a unique starfish that everyone can just look at and adore because we're one of a kind. No, they're not. It's not so you can be unique and stand alone and look good and impress everybody. God gives you these things so you can bless other people. So as we wrap up, Paul is giving them understanding about the source of these gifts and the purpose of these gifts. When we understand where something comes from and why it exists, that should shape our minds about how we should use it. I want to make two quick remarks. First, the fact that the Father works in tandem, or that God works in tandem with himself, in Father, Son, and Spirit, means that those persons will never disagree with themselves in a contradictory way. The Father, Son, and Spirit are working in complete harmony to achieve a unified aim. As such, someone claiming to have something revealed that contradicts God, they are self-condemned. All right. So I know there's times where the will of Christ and the will of the Father, seem to meet a head where Jesus ultimately submits to that. So there's questions there that I get that, but I'm just talking in the abstract, in the sense of at the level of essence and unity as they exist there. You want to have a Trinitarian question? I'd love to answer that question, obviously. I think this is a really cool discussion. But all that to say, that as they exist, there's no way they can actually truly contradict each other at that level in a way that causes a logical incoherency. The Godhead itself is demonstrating that these gifts and the diversity of them in its own persons and the diversity there, that itself, God becomes a picture of cooperation and unity. And any assertions about the manifestations, it's got to coalesce with revelation. So God's not going to reveal one thing through the Son and one thing through the Spirit or at a different time, a different place. It's all got to harmonize. And so if someone basically says, hey, the Spirit told me this, whenever He's already said over here, where God the Father's declared this, or the Son's declared this, or the Spirit has declared this in another place. If someone says something that contradicts, then they are, in fact, self-condemned. So further, as you probably know, the Corinthians are abusing these gifts, especially as a manifestation of pride and to create a pecking order where it's like, oh, would you look at, we made this order of the most important gifts, and what a coincidence, mine is at the top. It's the most important. The purpose isn't self-promotion. It's service. And to whom much is given, much is required. And it means my exercise of that gift must be with the good and flourishing of other people in mind and not myself. So as we think about that, what are your talents? What are your abilities, your expertise, your understanding and experience that God has blessed you with? Do you have a focus on using those things for others, or do you use them for yourself? Do you use them for the common good? Do you ensure that you exercise them in a way that profits other people, even if it's at a loss to yourself? Do you view yourself as a conduit of God's blessing to serve other people, or as a reservoir for the praise of people? Thanks so much for joining us today here at 15 Minutes and a Big Idea. Today's big idea: there's unity in our diversity.